We're going to be talking about ethical systems in this segment, and we're going to see that it'll be important for us to look at a way of understanding our needs. There are some really good case studies here in your ethics text, chapter 3, I believe it is. Yes, ethical systems and ways of moral reasoning. And so I encourage you, because it seems as we do this work, we'll be talking about broad strokes and theories and basic principles, but we're going to want to find ways to apply them quickly. So use the case studies in the Facing Messy Stuff in the Church text and in the Scott Ray text to help give you frames of reference for the things that we're talking about here in ethics. We'll see that ethics has to do at times with the question of what is right. What is the standard that we must follow? When we look at that, we're looking at the normative aspect of ethics. So a study of ethics looks at what our obligation is in a given situation, being faced with a certain conflict. What's our obligation? What is normative? Now that is not to be confused with the idea of normal. That would be the descriptive study of ethics, in which somebody's basically studying how do people behave. But it's one thing to describe how people behave, it's another thing to prescribe how they ought to behave. On the one hand, we're talking about the mere is of human nature. If we're to list the things that constitute human nature, we make a column with the word is at the top, describing what human nature is. We know that it'd be pretty easy to add some things on there that we don't like. For example, in the last 30 days, how many of you feel that you've been lied to, or at least misrepresented in some way or another, by someone trying to sell you something, perhaps? So it would be fair to put the term lying underneath the is column. And probably you've been cheated at some point in time in the last year, so it'd be fair to put cheating underneath the is column. Perhaps we've seen, or hopefully not been a victim of, but we've seen violence. So it'd be fair to put doing violent acts underneath the is column. This describes human nature. And we've also had people that have been kind to us, so acts of kindness, being kind, would be good to put under the is column of human nature. This describes what human nature is. And we'll have to list all the kinds of things that we would see in our descriptive is column. But over here, we'll create a column with, at the top of it, the word ought, O-U-G-H-T. Now, we're not going to want to take everything in the is column and just move it to the ought column. Rather than lying, what would you rather have be the case? In your perfect world, if you had your choice, rather than people lying to one another, you'd want them to be telling truth. Rather than cheating, you'd want people to be obeying the right, just rules, keeping the rules, especially the ones that count. Rather than acts of violence, we'd want people to resolve their conflict without having to hurt one another. Rather than being kind, we'd want them, no, wait a second, we'd want them to continue being kind. So some of the things in the is column get moved to the ought column, but we can't take the whole is column and put it there. That's why ethics can never be satisfied with merely describing human behaviors. The third aspect we look at is called meta-ethics, or about ethics. We'll try to understand how did people arrive at their moral decisions. So we have normative ethics, what we ought to do, descriptive ethics, which describes behaviors, and then meta-ethics, which describes how people reason to reach their ethical decisions. We've mentioned before some of the ways of moral reasoning, the deontological or duty-based approach, the teleological or utilitarian-based, looking at consequences and goals, the relativism approach, which looks at how do cultures or societies particularly act in certain situations. We looked at the egoist or the self-interest approach. We'll need to look at the emotivist approach. That ethics is certainly expressive of the things that we want to say yay about, And ethics is expressive of the things that we want to say, boo, don't like that about. Things that give us bad feelings are part of our ethical approach. Now, the emotivist actually believes that that's all that ethics is. And we can obviously see the shortfall in that. And we'll look at virtue theory. This emphasizes character traits that we want to see people have, not just actions. Well, there's three main types of deontological ethics. And basically, the first one is divine command. And it's probably been the oldest one. The idea that what God says is right, what God says is wrong, is pretty easy to understand as a basic approach to ethics. Natural law tells us that there are principles in the world that we can't deny. Of course you have to behave in a manner that you would want people to treat you. That idea of empathy, can't you imagine what it would be like to be treated this way? So don't do it yourself. That might be one of the earliest lessons Mom and Dad teach us. How would you like it if someone did that to you, they ask. And then there's Kantian deontology. This is devised by a man named Immanuel Kant, German philosopher in the 1700s. He said, we don't need the Bible, and we're not going to have to rely so much upon the tradition that may have come from natural law, but we can use our unaided human reason to arrive at the duties that we must do. And he believed duties were the most important thing. So actually, Immanuel Kant is an ally of Christian ethics insofar as he thinks that following your duty is very important, because Scripture does teach about duty. But he's not an ally when it comes to the basis for that duty. Natural law ethics says that in the world there are things revealed to us. We looked at one of those passages in our last segment on Romans. We recognize that it's a biblical basis for natural law ethics. Jeremiah 23 verses 25 through 26 gives us some clues here. The book of Proverbs tells us also. He says, go to the ant, you sluggard. Observe his ways and be wise. No one's bossing this ant around, but he still gets his work done. You should be self-motivated like that ant. And the Bible refers to things where we understand those natural law ethics in the world in which God has placed us. All right, we looked at deontological ethics. Now let's go to this teleological ethics as an ethical system. By the way, for it to be a system, it's something that is consistent, that seeks to elaborate, elucidate principles and stand on them. Teleological ethics is the idea that you do that which achieves your goal. And one of the most important teleological terms is utilitarian. What is useful for accomplishing my goal, or has the most utility? Some would say that that's the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Some say that what really counts is, in the particular situation you're in, what particular act should you do that will bring about the greatest good for the greatest number of people? That's called act utilitarianism. Others would say, that's just too flexible. It's too easy for us to find ways to violate moral rules. So they propose a rule utilitarianism. Which rule, if you follow it, will be most likely to produce the consequence that you hope for? So a rule of, let's take for example, do no harm. All right, pretty clear. Don't harm people. Don't do things that will result in harm. All right, if I follow that rule, will I be more or less likely to achieve my chosen goal? It seems like I need to follow that rule. When I'm harming things, it's not likely that they're going to be able to help me achieve my common goal, my chosen goal. And if I need someone else's help and I harm them, they're going to be less likely to help me. I won't achieve my goal. So yeah, I think following the rule is important. And that's rule utilitarianism. It's very appealing because we tend to make a lot of our decisions based upon that which has the best outcome. However, there's some big problems with utilitarianism because it involves predicting consequences. And we are woefully able to make mistakes at predicting consequences. We don't always know what will harm or benefit somebody. We also recognize that we might be likely to forget the consequences that minorities will feel from some of our actions. This was basically a utilitarian argument for slavery. The majority benefited by having people work for next to nothing. And so if you have an ethical system that violates some basic moral standards, you have good reason to question whether that's a good system or not. We also have that egoistic approach, the idea that what counts is what I want. And this is based upon what ethical egoists call psychological egoism. That is, people basically do what they want. You know, even if they're helping somebody, they're doing what they want. So they ought to do what they want. What makes something right is that you really want to do it. And I recall listening at retirement banquets where a man had worked for many years. They said, well, he probably could have done better for himself if he'd gone one way or another, but you know what? He liked what he was doing. And everybody applauds because that means he was right. He was good. He did what he wanted to do. Our culture has very high rewards for those who behave in an egoistic manner, at least short term. Now, later on, they often come to the kind of woe that the book of Proverbs describes. But in the short term, you can get a lot if you follow your own ego. You can climb up a lot of ladder and step on a lot of people's heads to get where you want. There's some problems with egoism. Some of those problems had to do with the fact that you really can't tell people you're an egoist if you expect to get what you want. So you sort of have to conceal your basic egoistic principles. In other words, it's a stealth ethical approach. People know you're an egoist, you're just out for your own interests. They're less likely to contribute to you getting your interests. If you can tell them you're really about something else, they're more likely to contribute to your own interests. So you have to keep it a secret. That's strange, an ethical system that advocates deception. Also, we don't always know what it is that we should want. At any given time, there's lots of different competing desires within our being. Oh, I'm thirsty. Oh, I'm hungry. Oh, I'm tired. Well, I haven't had fun today, and so I'm studying. Well, there's all kinds of things that determine what we're doing. We want to study because we want the degree. We want to play because we're fun-loving creatures. How do I determine which one of those competing wants I'm going to follow? And to me, one of the greatest shortfalls of ethical egoism is it cannot tell you what you ought to want. Relativism. And it's quite dominant in our culture that people do what they believe is approved by their culture. Now, that's a very simple statement, but upon taking it apart, we recognize that it's more problematic than it appears once you first heard it. Relativism has quite a lot of appeal in Western culture because of a belief that minority cultures have not been paid their appropriate attention. And just because they don't happen to have the numbers or the economic clout or the political power, we don't have to care about the way small subcultures behave and what they believe to be is right. So multiculturalism is an attempt to do away with that bias. And it can oftentimes fold in the idea of ethical relativism. Let's study the many cultures. We'll recognize that cultures do follow differing moral standards. And in the end of the matter, it's really not a matter of really right or wrong. It's a matter of social consensus. In Rome, they do as the Romans do. Now, there are types of relativism. And now what I've just described is one of the problems with relativism. It makes us think that we're being disrespectful of other cultures if we don't allow for the moral rightness of their own beliefs. That's a problem, obviously. Cultures can have some very immoral beliefs and practices. A book by Francis Beckwith and Gregory Kukl brings out the fact that we think that we understand what societies say. And because we think we know what societies believe is right or wrong, we think we must then do what societies tell us is right or wrong. But upon closer analysis, we recognize we really don't know what a society, quote, says is right or wrong. How do you know? Go out and take a poll. That poll could change tomorrow, by the way. How do you know your poll is accurate? How do you know you've talked to enough people? How do you know the people you've asked really even have a moral decision or moral position on the question you've asked them? There's all kinds of problems with trying to determine what society says. But that's the basis for this, isn't it? Well, society says I must behave this way, and therefore, because society says it, I must do it. Well, really what it boils down to, Beckwith and Kukl conclude, is that it really boils down into individual relativism. How do I want to behave? And I will find support from some group in society that behaves in the way that I've chosen to behave. There's some problems with relativism, and that is that it's self-defeating. If you want to improve a culture, you can't do it relativistically, because it refers to the current prevalent beliefs of that culture and practices. Well, you can't condemn them, can you? That's what they're doing. That's the way you're supposed to do it. There was a time when it was wrong in many parts of America to give a hotel room to someone with slightly darker skin. Martin Luther King Jr. brought that out in his I Have a Dream speech, how he traveled the country, had to sleep in his car with his kids because he couldn't find a hotel that would give him a place to stay. But that was the prevailing norm in that culture. This is called the reformer's dilemma in ethics. There's no basis for reform. And if you can't find a basis for reform, then perhaps there's something wrong with the relativistic approach to ethics. Virtue theory tells us that we are focusing on the wrong aspect of ethics if we're only looking at actions. Actions derive their justification from virtues. Honest people tell truths. The action is the truth-telling, but it stems from being willing to be honest, having a heart disposition to being honest, not conceal or deceive. Charitable people do kind actions. Where does the charity come from? It's a virtue that is taught from childhood. Patient people are willing to delay and willing to accept delays. So the patience is there before the acceptance actually occurs. Now we recognize that this could be leveraged by someone who wants to pervert the definition of good, don't we? And we've seen great, strong leaders, great in that they had great impact, strong leaders who perverted virtue, like with the Hitler Youth of Nazi Germany in the 1930s, training children to behave according to their most base instincts. They actually created packs of children, young boys, and allowed them to run free on the weekends. If you wanted to steal from a house, that's okay. That's what it took to make the pack work. Their goal was to produce cadres of fighting men. And if they had not been stopped, they had been much more successful because of the Hitler Youth. But certainly that's a perversion of what's good. The Young Pioneer movement in Soviet Union organized children in a manner of the Boy Scouts, but part of what they did was they were to look out for people who were creating small businesses and violating communist principles. And if necessary, they were to turn in their very own parents as good young pioneers. So we can see the word good and the virtue of good being perverted based upon a prevailing policy. And that's one of those downfalls of virtue ethics. In conclusion, these systems have one main point of difference. That is the source of moral authority. At the base of it, what gives the utilitarian the full confidence that what makes something right is that it is the most useful to accomplish his chosen goal. At the base of it, what makes the relativist believe that what makes something right is that that's the way society behaves. At the base of it, what makes the Kantian deontologist right when he believes that human reason, unaided by God, can arrive at moral duties? And if you can question the basic principles upon which these systems are based, then you have some good insight into whether or not this really defines what ethics is about. Scripture uses a variety of types of reasoning, but it's primarily deontological and virtue-based. As you watch the news, watch for the way that the issues get discussed. Watch for how people end up determining right and wrong. In the Western culture, and the one that I'm familiar with is the American culture, oftentimes it will be utilitarian. What will provide the best outcome? And oftentimes it's utilitarian with a very short view of the future. What will provide the best outcome for the near future, for the greatest number of people? And we'll see that occasionally in a military setting, we'll get the duty-based approach. You've got to do your duty regardless of what you think the consequences might be. Oftentimes in our popular culture, certainly in the entertainment culture, it's about pleasure. People seek out entertainment so they can have pleasure, right? They want to be entertained, so hey, maybe that's the purpose of life, is to have pleasure. And that would be an egoist approach to life. So we see ourselves faced with some challenges, don't we? We live in a culture that operates on a variety of different principles. May the Lord help us.